Hi everyone, welcome to this conversation on feminism and science with Dr. Gita Chadha on doing sociology. To introduce our speaker, she is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai. Dr. Chadha's areas of academic interest include sociological theory, feminist science studies, sociology of knowledge, intersectional feminist epistemologies, and visual culture. She has designed and taught the first feminist science studies course in India at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, TISS, Mumbai. She has developed frameworks for feminist archiving at the Research Center for Women's Studies, SNDT Women's University, and has designed interdisciplinary pedagogic initiatives for integrating science and social science teaching. Apart from it, she's also a prolific scholar and has edited, co-edited, and written books on feminism and science. Welcome, Dr. Chadha, to this conversation, and I must express my delight at having you and, currently reading your work. So welcome and thank you once again for doing this.
Thank you, Rituparna, and doing sociology. I think you're doing fantastic work and I'm very happy to be here.
So let me begin by asking you the very basic question of, what is the relationship between feminism and science? How do you as a, scholar see that question?
Yeah. So, it's important for us to first see both feminism and science as part of an entire project of modernity. Yeah, within the whole context of the Enlightenment period and the use of reason and rationality for constructing knowledge for charting progressive societies and social transformations. So in a way, they both have very similar roots, which also respect individual liberty in criticality. But what happens is that, and this is much like all our social sciences, even sociology sort of was born with the dream of becoming a science of society. But what happens in the 60s is with us entering globally into the risk societies with the Cold Wars, with the environmental disasters that we were slowly inviting. The movements, whether it's the pacifist movement, the environmentalist movement, the women's movement, actually started challenging the very paradigm of modernity and with its foundation of science and technology. And as a feminist science studies scholar, Evelyn Fox Keller says that for the field of feminist science studies, which basically is an attempt to look at science critically from gender perspectives, two things had to happen. And what she says is the science studies as a field had to develop in the social sciences, which basically means that being able to integrate philosophy, history, sociology, literature, the various disciplines to look at science as an institution, science as a knowledge-making system in a critical manner and located very much within socio-cultural, economic, political context. And she also argues saying that feminist theory had to mature in a particular direction for really feminist science studies to emerge. What she basically says is that, feminist theory had to move from understanding individuals as constituted and made by gender, relations of power as constituted and made by gender, to actually looking at cognitive and imaginative spaces as also being deeply gendered, whether it was art or whether it was science, to understand the implicit and the symbolic role of gender in knowledge-making practices. And what I argue is that in India for feminism, so feminist science studies actually began globally around the 1980s in a way. Yeah. But in India, I think that another thing had to happen before we started looking at science as feminist critically. And that was a critique of development and the kind of models of development that we had adopted. And to be able to understand and critically examine the models of development and the foundations that science provided for that, science and technology. So I'd say that the relationship of feminism and science is difficult because science is an emancipatory tool for the feminist project. And yet we fully recognize, also have begun to recognize, how science also reproduces gender hierarchies and reproduces patriarchies. And so it's a very, it's a difficult relationship. But I'd say that it is sort of getting more and more formulated in at all levels. So I think the relationship is a tense one, and within feminists also there is a lot of debate on it. What to do with science, no?
Right. So I also want to know about the ways in which feminists should navigate their way out of the epistemological as well as the ontological relativism, because it argues that what is held is true and real, and it is a product of the context in which it is produced, right? I know
Yeah.
it's a difficult question, but if you could throw some light on it.
Yeah, no, it's an difficult, but it's the central question. Feminist science studies, the work that we do is at multiple levels, beginning with asking questions of low participation of women in science, to asking more foundational questions about the methodology of science. What is the ontological assumption that science makes, for example, about nature, and how nature as a feminized entity has been seen in relation to science. Nature as being something which is a resource, something which is to be controlled, something which is wild, something which is feminine. Yeah. So in this sense, the ontological assumptions that science makes about nature is something that comes under a lot of scrutiny by us feminists. And the equation that is made between nature and women is something that comes under a lot of scrutiny. And there's a lot of work on the history of the development of science. And for example, the language used in Francis Bacon's understanding of science. A lot of modern scientists and philosophers will tell you that, no, but that's all outdated. It doesn't really matter anymore. But actually, you see it working its way. It has worked its way into popular culture. It works its way into the everyday practices of science. This idea that nature obeys the laws, okay, and the laws are discovered by human beings. It's a very anthropocentric sort of understanding of nature. And what feminism has provided for us is a more connected, a more integrated approach to nature. So that's one thing. And about the epistemological, I think basically the idea that the historian John Viv Lloyd puts forward is that a lot of Enlightenment philosophy was based on the Cartesian dualism of the division between mind and body, reason and emotion, public and private, culture and nature, and male and female, and masculine and feminine. So what she argues is that historically, the development of modern science went hand in hand with the development of gender. So that which was privileged as scientific, as reasonable, as rational, was positioned in opposition to what was seen as feminine, what was seen as emotional and natural. So she argues that it is this simultaneous development of scientific method and gender ideologies. This is extremely instructive for us to be able to understand and critique science. So, for instance, it's not very difficult for us to actually recognize that the kind of work and the kind of labor that was, for example, privileged in Darwin's evolutionary theory was the work that, or the labor, or the knowledges that were being, done by men. And the kind of work which was compared to, cooperative work of food gathering, tending to the sick, tending to the young, was not seen as very relevant for species survival. So feminist critiques of, for example, biology or evolution theory will sort of contest this kind of an ontological assumption of the human species. And epistemologically also, even today, if you see the research designs, very often that, taking again the example of biology, things are changing rapidly. I'm very glad for that. The male model of the species is generally the one that is studied. Large number of samples have more male of the species than the female. And in this sense, how does this impact? How do we read this? It's basically a sort of a normalization of the masculine of a species as being the normative one. So, and when women are studied, or when the female of a species is studied, it's often for the reproductive function and not for anything else. So in that sense, the kind of, therefore, the theories that come out of from this kind of science about sex and gender are quite stereotypical and reproduce social ideologies of gender. But Rituparna, here I also want to bring in the question of language. I think the language that is used a lot by modern science often tends to be patriarchal, often tends to be quite sexist in its. And there's a classic work of Emily Martin who talks about how reproductive technologies reproductive processes are actually depicted. The egg is depicted as a passive entity, and the sperm as a more active entity. This is a classic work. So the question of language, the question of our ontological understandings of what is nature, the questions of what is actually valid scientific knowledge, in a way, all of these contain our argument is, and our submission is that the deeply contained gender biases. So I think but I think your question, I think your question is that if we say this, that scientific knowledge is rooted in social context and social location, then how do we get away from the problem of what, postmodernist understanding of a total relativism? I think that was your question. So as Harding says that there are three kinds of positions in feminist relationship to feminist epistemologies or feminist relationship to science. One is what she calls a feminist empiricist project, which basically argues that, there is nothing wrong really with the scientific method per se, that it is, if we eliminate the bias and we correct the research design, we will be able to do less gender biased science, and we must do that. A lot of women in science actually do believe this. And then she talks about feminist standpoint theory, which basically says that no, theories and knowledges can look very different from marginal locations, and their perspectives are very important for us to actually become more objective. So this was the Strong Programs project. And then she also talks about how postmodernist relativism actually also has been a very good ally in a way for feminism. And she actually suggests that in the social sciences, this has led to a polemics between the modernists and the postmodernists, whereas in feminism, this becomes a rich space. It's an ambivalent space and it's a rich space. Personally, what I think I have over the years come to myself is that while postmodernism and relativism of truth is a very, very important direction of feminist science studies, it, like Harding says, does not work for our politics. For our politics, if we go into that kind of a position, what happens is you relativize all truth. Then how do you, justify or validate the truth of people from the margins? So I would say it's standpoint epistemology, and which actually helps us both in terms of the politics of knowledge making and the politics of a more gender just scientific world or a gender just world. So yeah, it's difficult to really take any one position on these three. I think for us, it's important to take all these positions at different points strategically.
Right. So, is science to be held accountable for the number of women in science, or is society responsible?
Yeah, so that's a very, very important question, because see, we when I started off in this field, I was looking much more at more complex issues of epistemology and ontology and scientific method, and I thought that the women's question in science was really not our question. But over a period of time, I've completely rethought that. And I think that the underrepresentation of women in science, or let's say the overrepresentation in some kind of fields which are feminized, say like biology, and very few numbers in fields like physics. In order to sort of answer and understand these questions, I think it became very important for us to shift methodologically, for us to shift the focus from saying that this is a problem of society, that there are few women in science because society is patriarchal, society is sexist, society does not encourage. But what is society, right? Isn't science very much a part of that same society? So I think one of the major things that we did as feminist science studies scholars is shift the perspective from this whole or shift the explanation from society to actually science, and put science within located firmly within society, and the spotlight on what is science doing actually to keep women, and not just women but other marginal groups also, out of science, and how we need to address those questions. And interestingly, what I want to tell you is that while there is a need to talk about numbers, we also recognize that there is also a need for people like us to generate narratives behind numbers. Because even if you see women in science, the experience of being there is a deeply gendered one, is often one where they experience discrimination. They might or might not see it, they might or might not articulate it. Yeah. But if you probe further and if you seek the narratives, then you will find and discover and encounter the fact that their experiences are deeply gendered. So I think for us, the shifts was from numbers shift to narratives. That was the second major shift that we did in this whole question of women in science. And the third thing that I want to say is that it has been a very difficult challenge to make allies with women in science and feminist science studies scholars. There's always a tension. Okay, women in science feel that they don't want to push the question of the nature of science, the ontology or the methodology. They, as I said, they largely believe in certain kind of feminist empiricism. So they don't want to push that question, and feminist science studies scholars need to push that question. But over a few years, what we've recognized is that there are ways of building conversations between women in science and feminist science studies scholars. And I must say that we've had some breakthroughs, and that if you look at the EPW issue, which Asha and I edited, of narratives of women in science, I think we found that all of those narratives indicate the boys' club in science and how that restricts their full-throated participation. We also encountered through their narratives, discovered how their self-esteem gets diminished continuously, even when they're in extremely successful position. The self and the pressure to prove yourself more and more, the imposter syndrome, all of that. And so I think women in science are also now beginning to recognize, because the earlier generation, say of the 60s, 70s, even 80s, women in science would also accept the argument that there are fewer women in science because of their dual responsibilities of social reasons. But in the last in the last decade or so, I think women in science have themselves begun to recognize that the problem lies within science and scientific institutions, and they're doing a wonderful job of actually addressing some of these questions. Yeah. So,
Right. Yes, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I also wanted to say that today, when we talk about this question, I think as feminists, contemporary feminists, we recognize that we can't talk only about gender. So we have to be more intersectional in our perspectives. So when we talk about the question of caste, when you talk about the question of sexuality, we recognize that even when women come in, the women that are able to enter are often women from upper caste backgrounds, are Savarna women. And how do we make science much more inclusive to not just women, but to people from marginal caste groups, from people from queer constituency, how we need to sort of make science into a much more inclusive place for all people who wish to do science.
Right. So how do post-colonial feminists relate to the indigenous or traditional systems or ways of knowledge and practices held by women? Because that question also becomes important when we talk of feminism and science.
Yeah. So for anybody who critiques, say, Western systems of knowledge or Oriental systems, Occident systems that came from the global North, that came from what we call the Occident, anybody who critiques that and is seeking alternatives to that is deeply engaged with this question of what do we do with indigenous knowledge systems? What do we do with traditional knowledge systems? And what happens is that if we try to go back to seek some glorious past of non-Western cultures where things were all hunky-dory, rosy, and all systems of knowledge there are to be presented as alternatives, we get into deep trouble. Okay, because see, if you really look at the classic book of the late 80s, Science, Hegemony and Violence, edited by Ashish Nandi, which had some fantastic essays, okay, by Vandana Shiva, by Shiv Vishwanathan, and so the critique in that volume of modern Western science is tremendous and very powerful, okay? But if you look carefully at the essays and you look at the kind of alternatives that they put forward, those alternatives that come from Indian tradition or Indian history, whether drawing upon Gandhi or whether drawing upon the Purusha Prakriti traditions of Vedic texts, is that, according to me, perhaps was a limitation of that kind of a exercise. Over the years, what we've learned, and you'll see this in our feminist and science volumes, that we do engage with local systems of knowledges, we do engage with indigenous systems of knowledges that women hold. But the kind of perspective that we try to take is that these systems also require to be critiqued as much as modern Western science does, because they were also deeply implicated in patriarchal processes. They were deeply implicated in caste structures. So it becomes very important for us to, if we are looking at local, indigenous, what we call traditional practices, it becomes extremely important for us to be careful of two things. One is to not make an identity politics between Western and non-Western cultures and move towards looking at these knowledge systems and these cultures becoming more and more hybridized. Of course, the power remains with the global North, but also it's important for us to continuously be critical of the traditions that we talk about. So let me give you the example of, for example, midwifery practices, which two of the essays in our volumes, which you should engage with, are one by Asha Achutan, who talks about how the midwife's skill is appropriated, for example, her ethnographic work as a medical doctor in a hospital in Calcutta, and how the midwife, the dai, gets her skill gets appropriated, or used, but she is never given the status of a knower, as somebody who can produce knowledge, because the work that she does is seen as more skill and not as knowledge. So she makes that kind of an argument. And Meena Gopal, on the other hand, argues very persuasively about the stigmatization of the dai and the knowledge that she produces, also because of her caste location. So it's important for us to do this double oeuvre of seeing how, say, a modern obstetrics and gynecology practices actually what they do with the DICE practices, and to see how better these can be integrated in more just, epistemically just ways, but to also see how traditional structures of knowledge making was stigmatizing practices like the midwife practices because of their because the work was considered to be impure or done by the women of the lower caste. Yeah. So I think for us, it's a tricky question, but it's an important one, because when we have to look at alternatives, we will have to look at more and more hybrid forms or formations of knowledge. And so I think, because, these are living traditions, they've not gone anywhere. So whether it's midwifery, whether it's Ayurveda, whatever it is. But we have to be very careful that we don't make it into a kind of a, a lot of post-colonial scholarship, we have to be careful about that. So we also have to be careful about that we don't make it about, the bad West and the good East kind of a thing. And it's also varied, no, Rituparna? Indigenous systems, when we talk about, they are so varied and so complex. So it's very, very hard for us to sort of box them into one category. I don't know whether that answers your question.
That definitely does. And, I also want to know a little bit about your own ethnographic work on the creative process in science, as well as how you have problematized this notion of the scientific genius.
Yeah. So I think coming back to that register is that, one of the things that we also, when I started this work, I was more intrigued by the question of intuition. Okay. I was already hearing, talking, reading a lot about the creative process in science and the scientific method. And what we receive it as in the meta-narrative, in the popular culture, is that it's a very linear process. It's a neat process, yeah, scientific method, or in the production of scientific knowledge. But the more I read and more I engaged, I realized that there was an entire discourse of
Yeah, you can continue.
so when I was asking early on questions about the scientific method, what struck me was that it is not as linear and as neat as we think of it in the meta-narrative of science, in the popular understanding of science. And the more you talk to scientists, they will themselves tell you that, we don't work like that in actuality. Yeah. And this question of the scientific method is something that philosophers are worried about, but we do what works. And yet, whenever a scientific or scientist is asked to speak about the question of method or the question of what distinguishes science from anything else, they'll come up with this idea of the scientific method as being linear, rational, driven by facts, that kind of a thing. And largely what is called the hypothetical deductive method. They'll all sort of give you a rough idea that it is that. I was extremely intrigued by looking at how paradigm shifts also happen in science. So I wanted to explore this question of the role of intuition in the production of scientific knowledge. And I wanted to look at biographies very carefully, whether it's post-colonial intellectuals like scientists like Ramanujan, J.C. Bose, who all spoke about knowledge as not, scientific knowledge as not just being produced by the scientific method, but as something else also. Yeah, so Ramanujan spoke about how scientific mathematical proofs were given to him by his goddess of Namakkal and all of that. Yeah, there's a brilliant analysis by Ashish Nandi again on Bose and Ramanujan called alternative sciences. But in my own work, what I found is that, the idea of creativity in science as we receive it is that the scientific intellectual works as an individual, that all scientific truths are largely the genius of the individual mind. Yeah. And this individual is generally of exceptional talent. Yeah. And the discourse is hugely on talent. Yeah. Exceptional talent. And so the idea of genius is this very unreal, extra social person, who is driven by an exceptional urge, drive to produce this kind of knowledge. And so I decided in the Kuhnian sense to look at how normal scientists work. Yeah, what is called scientists working to produce normal science. And what I realized is that creativity, through their narratives, I could see works in three phases. One is the genesis phase, which often they say comes through sharing of ideas. It's a collaborative effort. The second phase, when they're working on a problem, they say becomes a very private space. Okay. And the third phase is again something where they have to share the results. So what share the results in terms of how the community wants it, in the journals that are considered as valid and valuable. So what I found is a very interesting interplay between the collaborative, collective role of the community in the production of scientific knowledge, and the interplay of that with individual talent and individual ability, which is also a function of, to a large extent, of social privilege, and which is also a function of leisure. But having said that, I also encountered the kind of myth making that you find around the scientific genius. The scientific genius is made and constructed in the scientific community. And if you look at it historically, you analyze it better, you realize that this notion of the genius as an individual talented person is also something that we can take back and understand it and fix it and locate it within modernity. And this idea of the individual genius, the individual male genius. Now, this is a deep problem for a more equitable participation of people in science, because one is the entry and the other is this whole becoming the genius, is something which is very difficult for people who come from marginal communities and marginal groups. So I think we need to sort of debunk or demystify or challenge this question of the scientific genius, because I also think that it's very hard on those people who get dubbed as geniuses. Yeah, they have to lead extremely unnatural and unsocial lives, is what I'd say. And also it becomes a way of giving concession and a chit, giving clean chit to people who are considered to be exceptional. Then whatever kind of social transgressions they are responsible for, they get a clean chit, and we saw this in the Me Too movement. We see it constantly in the sexual harassment cases that come, he's a genius, so he needs to get a special treatment. And that is highly very unfair and unjust practice. So it's complicated. I think the participation of women is restricted in science because of the notions of merit that we have. But it's also restricted because of the notions of worth, who is worthy of doing science. And this idea of a innately talented genius is something that we need to really problematize and understand, that a lot of excellence in science, a lot of good work in science happens because of people's volition, and their desire to do what they are doing. So I think if we keep that in mind, it might be easier for us to make equitable cultures of science.
Right. So thank you so much for speaking to us on this very interesting and engaging topic on feminism and science, or the relationship between the two. I hope, yes.
There's one thing I want to say, Ritparna, and that is on the question of pedagogy. Yeah, I think, the important thing is that science education, whether it is at school or whether it's at higher education institutions, needs to become much more integrated with the social sciences, with the humanities. And this kind of integration, because our models of development of the academia have also been research in research institutes of excellence and teaching in the universities. So what happens is that we make these ivory towers of excellent research, and the interaction with university spaces, the interaction with the social sciences and the humanities is very limited. And in that sense, therefore, the critique that we need to come from within science is not happening as much as it should. So one would strongly feel that, in making the scientist, we also need to introduce them to understanding the history, the philosophy, the sociology, the anthropology of science. If we do that, I think we'll be able to take science out of this very esoteric mold, and maybe make it more inclusive in that sense. Perhaps, I don't know what you think.
No, yeah, of course, I am in agreement. And thank you for, raising that issue at the end. Once again, thank you so much for this conversation. And I hope our readers and listeners take away a lot from it and actually become interested in the, discipline as well. So thank you once again.
I hope so. There's a lot of material out there. I don't know today whether I could do justice to it. So thank you.